Welcome to our deep dive into learned optimism.
Mhm.
You challenged us with a really fascinating book, Learned Optimism: How to Change Your Mind and Your Life by Martin Seligman. It's quite a journey, into like how we think and how that affects uh, everything we do, like from being depressed or achieving things to our physical health. I mean, he even touches on politics.
Yeah, it really is. What I think is really powerful in this book is this idea that optimism is not just like something, some personality trait
Yeah.
that you're just stuck with. You're born an optimist or pessimist, but it's more like, a skill you can learn and develop. And
Yeah.
Seligman argues that anyone can learn these skills to become more optimistic. And he's got decades of research to back it up.
So no more, I'm just a gloomy Gus. That's how I am. You can actually retrain your brain.
Exactly.
I really like the concept of explanatory style. Just click for me.
Mm.
It's like how we explain, why things happen to us, especially the bad stuff.
Yeah.
So you think about a time you've had a setback. It could be big or small. How did you explain it to yourself? Why did it happen?
That's exactly it. And Seligman breaks this down into three dimensions of explanatory style. Um, Permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization. So let's just say,
Yeah.
you're applying for a job and you get rejected. A pessimist might think, oh, I'm just no good at interviews, I'll never get hired. So that's permanent. They see it as some unchangeable part of them, and it's also pervasive.
Right.
It affects their whole job search, their whole career. And it's personal. They put all the blame on themselves.
So they've basically made this negative feedback loop in their mind.
Right.
But how would an optimist explain the same thing?
An optimist would probably say something like, okay, that interview, it didn't go as well as I'd hoped. Maybe I need to work on how I answer those questions about teamwork. That particular company wasn't the right fit, but there are a lot of other jobs out there. So they see the cause as temporary. It was just specific to that interview. And it's something they can control. They can get better at it.
So they're like looking for the lesson in the setback, not just,
Yeah.
wallowing in all the negativity.
Yeah, precisely. And this difference in explanatory style, it's huge. It affects everything. Seligman's research shows that people who are optimistic, they tend to be more resilient when bad things happen. They keep going when they're trying to reach a goal. And ultimately, they're more successful in all kinds of areas of life.
And he's got some pretty strong examples to back that up. I remember this study about those metropolitan life insurance agents.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. Seligman found that. The optimistic agents, they sold way more insurance than the pessimistic ones, even though they were all selling the same policies. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. These optimistic agents, they were better at bouncing back when a customer said no, they didn't take it personally,
Yeah.
or see it as like a permanent roadblock. They just kept going. And that persistence really paid off.
I mean, it makes you wonder if companies should be testing for optimism when they're hiring.
Right.
But it wasn't just sales, was it? I was reading about West Point cadets, too.
Oh, that's right. Seligman looked at those West Point cadets, going through that really grueling beast barracks training. It's super intense. And he found the same thing. The optimistic cadets, they were more likely to keep going and do well, even with all that pressure. They didn't see the challenges as impossible to overcome or think they were doomed to fail. They just kept pushing forward. And that helped them succeed.
It's almost like they see challenges as a way to prove themselves,
Mm-hmm.
how strong and determined they are, rather than as something that could defeat them. This is powerful stuff.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, where does explanatory style even come from? Is it something you're born with, or is it from our experiences?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Seligman digs deep into that. He says there are a few factors. A mother's explanatory style can influence her children. Also, the criticism kids get from adults, especially teachers, that can really shape a child's outlook. And even big historical events, like the Great Depression, can affect a whole generation's explanatory style. It's almost like we inherit and absorb these ways of thinking from the world around us.
So it's not nature versus nurture. It's both. They both play a role in how we see the world.
Right, and that can be, empowering because it means we're not stuck with one way of thinking, but also shows how much responsibility we have as parents, as educators, even just as people, interacting with each other.
It makes you think about the messages we're sending to people around us, especially kids. Are we encouraging them to see failures as chances to learn and get better? Or are we accidentally making them feel helpless?
That's a really important point. Seligman says that the way we criticize children, that can have a huge impact on their explanatory style. Harsh criticism, attacking their character, that can chip away at their self-esteem and make them see setbacks as proof that there's something wrong with them. Imagine being told that you're stupid or lazy as a kid. Those words can really stick with you.
Yeah. It's like planting seeds of pessimism. That can turn into really deep beliefs.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if we focus on their behavior and offer solutions
Mm.
instead of labeling them, we can help them develop a more resilient and optimistic
Mm.
way of thinking.
Right. So, for example, instead of saying, "You're so messy," you could say something like, "Looks like you're having some trouble keeping your toys organized. How about we come up with a system together to make cleaning up easier?" You know it's about offering guidance and support, not judgment and discouragement.
And it's not just parents and caregivers.
Yeah.
Teachers, coaches, mentors, anyone who works with kids, they have the power to shape how those kids see the world in a good way or a bad way.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that our words and actions, they have power, especially with young minds.
Seligman also talks about how big events, like the Great Depression, can shape a whole generation's explanatory style. Imagine going through a time when everyone is struggling financially. You see how it affects your whole community. It's understandable why people might start to see the world in a more pessimistic way.
It shows that our explanatory style isn't just based on what happens to us personally, it's also shaped by the bigger picture, the historical and cultural context
Yeah.
of our lives.
So we've got
Hmm.
our personal experiences
Mm.
and the wider world,
Mm.
all shaping how we explain things, which then has this huge impact on how we deal with life's challenges. But if pessimism can be learned, can optimism be learned too?
Absolutely. And that's what makes Seligman's work so empowering. He doesn't just point out the problem, he offers a solution. He introduces this thing called the ABCDE model. It's a practical framework for challenging those negative thoughts and developing a more optimistic, explanatory style.
Okay, the ABCDE model. This sounds like the key to unlocking a more optimistic mindset. So let's break that down. What does ABCDE stand for and how does it work?
Well, it starts with A, adversity. That's the tough situation. The event that triggers those negative thoughts could be anything, from missing your train to losing your job.
Okay, so we've got the adversity. That's what kicks off the whole process. What's next?
Then comes B, beliefs. These are the automatic thoughts, the ones that just pop into your head when you face that adversity. So, for example, you miss your train, and your automatic thought is, "Ugh, this always happens to me. I'm always late."
Those are like our knee-jerk reactions. We often don't even realize we're having them, and I'm guessing they're often pretty negative, especially if we're prone to pessimism.
Yeah, exactly. And those negative beliefs, they lead to C consequences, which are the emotional and behavioral outcomes of those beliefs. So if you believe that you're always late, you might feel frustrated, anxious, or just resigned to being late all the time.
So we've got the adversity, the belief, and the consequences, this chain reaction. And if we're not careful, it can spiral into a really negative place. But this is where the learned part of learned optimism comes in.
Right?
We can learn to interrupt that cycle.
Precisely. And that's where D comes in, disputation. This is where we actually challenge and argue against those negative beliefs. Instead of just accepting them as facts, we start to question whether they're really true and look for other ways to explain the situation.
So it's like putting those negative thoughts on trial,
Yeah.
demanding evidence, and really scrutinizing their claims. How do we go about disputing them effectively?
Seligman gives us several techniques. One is to just examine the evidence. Is your belief actually supported by the facts? Maybe you miss your train sometimes, but are you really always late? Maybe you were late today because of some unexpected delay, not because there's some flaw in your character.
It's about taking a step back and looking at things objectively, instead of letting our emotions distort our perception.
Right. Another technique is to explore other explanations. So, you missed your train, but does that mean your whole day is ruined? What are some other possible outcomes? Maybe you'll get some extra work done while you wait, or maybe you'll run into an old friend you haven't seen in ages.
So it's about shifting our focus from the potential negative to the potential positive, even in a seemingly negative situation.
Exactly. And when you challenge those negative beliefs and replace them with more optimistic and empowering ones, you reach the final step, E, energization.
Energization. What does that mean in this context?
That's the positive shift
Thank you.
in your emotions and motivation. That comes from successfully challenging those negative thoughts. When you replace those pessimistic beliefs with more optimistic ones, you start to feel more hopeful, more energized, and more empowered to take action.
So it's not just about thinking positive thoughts. It's about those thoughts leading to positive feelings
Yeah.
and actions.
Precisely. And that's the real power of the ABCD model. It's not just a mental exercise, it's a tool for transforming our entire experience.
So the ABCDE model is like a roadmap for taking control of our thinking patterns and shifting from a pessimistic to a more optimistic outlook.
Yeah.
But Seligman doesn't stop there, does he? He also looks at the bigger picture, how our thinking patterns affect society as a whole.
You're thinking about his exploration of the maximal self and how it might be connected to depression in modern society.
Yes, that's the part that really got me thinking. It seems strange that striving to be our best selves could somehow be linked to depression.
It's a really interesting observation, and it challenges the idea that individual happiness and self-fulfillment are the ultimate goals. Seligman argues that this constant focus on the self, while it might seem empowering, can actually create a sense of emptiness and meaninglessness, especially when people face setbacks or fail to reach those really high goals they set for themselves.
It's like we're setting ourselves up for disappointment.
Right.
By putting so much emphasis on individual achievement, we become so focused on our own happiness that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
Exactly. And when those setbacks happen, and they always do, the individualistic mindset, it makes it hard to cope. We blame ourselves, we isolate ourselves from others, and we see those setbacks as proof that we're failures.
So if this constant pursuit of the maximal self can lead to this feeling of emptiness, what's the antidote? What's the alternative?
Seligman proposes this fascinating idea, the commons, this refers to, the shared beliefs, values, and institutions that give us a sense of meaning and purpose that goes beyond our own self-interest. Think of it as the opposite of all about me. It's about connecting to something larger than ourselves.
It sounds like a call to find meaning and purpose in something bigger than our own personal goals, and to cultivate a sense of belonging and connection to something greater than ourselves. But what does the commons actually look like in practice?
It can take many forms. It depends on your own values and interests. It could be a commitment to family, community, religious faith, social justice, environmental activism, or any other cause that goes beyond our own individual needs and desires.
So it's about finding the areas where our passions and values intersect with a sense of purpose. That's bigger than our own self-interest.
Exactly. It's about finding the things that energize us and make us feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves, contributing to something meaningful.
This is all making me think about the different ways Seligman's work can apply to different areas of life. We've talked about achievement and health, but I'm really curious to see how these ideas play out in specific areas like parenting, education, and even politics.
Those are all great areas to explore. Let's start with parenting. Seligman has a whole chapter on how explanatory style develops in children. And as we mentioned earlier, he highlights the influence of a mother's explanatory style on her children. It's like a blueprint that gets passed down through generations.
It's a powerful reminder that children are always watching and learning from their environment, especially from the adults they trust. Our own explanatory styles, whether we're optimistic or pessimistic, they can have a ripple effect on the next generation.
And it's not just about what we say, it's also about how we model optimism or pessimism in our own lives. Kids are incredibly perceptive. They pick up on those subtle cues and behaviors.
So as parents, we have a responsibility to not only teach our kids about optimism, but to actually live it ourselves. Our actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. And this goes for how we respond to our children's challenges and setbacks. Are we encouraging them to see failures as opportunities to grow and learn, or are we accidentally reinforcing a sense of helplessness?
Seligman talks about the importance of constructive criticism, focusing on specific behaviors rather than attacking their character. Remember that example we talked about before? Instead of saying, "You're so careless,"
Right.
we could say, "It seems like you're having trouble remembering to put your toys away. Let's work together on a system to make cleaning up easier."
That's a great example. By framing criticism in a constructive way, we're helping kids develop a more optimistic explanatory style. And the belief that they have the power to change and improve, we're teaching them to see setbacks as temporary and something they can overcome, not something that defines them.
It's about empowering them to be active agents in their own lives, rather than passive victims of circumstance. Speaking of empowering,
Yeah.
Seligman also talks about teaching children, the ABCDE model itself.
That's right. He thinks it's never too early to start equipping kids with the tools to challenge their negative thoughts and build a more resilient mindset.
It's like giving them a superpower, the ability to control their thoughts and emotions, rather than letting their thoughts and emotions control them.
Exactly. And those skills will help them throughout their lives, not just when they're kids.
It makes me think about how we could use Seligman's work in education. Imagine if these concepts were part of the school curriculum.
That's an area where Seligman's work has already had a big impact. His research has inspired a lot of programs that teach optimism and resilience to students of all ages.
I can see how valuable those programs could be, especially in today's world, where there's so much pressure on students to succeed. Teaching them these skills could help them cope with stress and prepare them for the challenges they'll face after they graduate.
It's about encouraging a growth mindset, where challenges are seen as opportunities to learn and setbacks are viewed as temporary and surmountable. And that can have a ripple effect, not just on their grades, but also on their self-esteem, their motivation, and their overall well-being.
This brings us to another interesting area where Seligman's work has been applied: politics. You remember his research on the explanatory styles of presidential candidates?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He found that. The more optimistic candidates, they tended to win elections, which suggests that voters are attracted to leaders who offer hope and a vision for a better future. It makes sense intuitively. When times are tough and there's a lot of uncertainty, people are more likely to support leaders who inspire confidence and offer a vision for a brighter future.
And it's not just about winning elections. Seligman argues that optimistic leaders, they're generally more effective at motivating people, overcoming obstacles, and achieving ambitious goals.
It's about creating a culture of possibility, where people believe that change is possible and that they have the power to shape their own destiny.
Which brings us back to that concept of the commons we talked about earlier. Optimistic leaders often inspire people to come together and work towards a common goal, creating a sense of collective purpose and belonging.
It's a good reminder that leadership isn't just about individual charisma or ambition. It's about fostering hope, resilience, and a sense of purpose, whether you're in a position of power or not.
It's a reminder that we all have the potential to be leaders, not necessarily in formal roles, but in how we inspire and influence others.
And Seligman's work gives us a guide for how to develop those leadership qualities within ourselves and in the next generation. It's about shifting our focus from me to we and understanding that our individual well-being is connected to the well-being of our communities and the world around us. So welcome back to our deep dive into learned optimism. Before the break, we were talking about how powerful the ABCDE model is as a tool to shift from that pessimistic thinking to a more optimistic outlook.
It's such a practical framework, and I'm really eager to see how we can actually use it in everyday life. So let's say, you're facing a challenge. Maybe you got some criticism at work, or you're just feeling overwhelmed with a project. How could you use the ABCDE model to sort of navigate those feelings and thoughts?
Well, it all starts with awareness. The A, adversity, is really about pinning down that specific challenge you're facing. What actually happened? What are the facts of the situation?
So no more vague statements like, oh, my life is a mess. We got to get specific, like my boss gave me some negative feedback on that presentation.
Exactly. Once you've got the adversity, you move to B, beliefs. So what are those automatic thoughts? The ones that just pop into your head? Are they pessimistic? Like, I'm terrible at giving presentations, or my boss hates me.
And I imagine those pessimistic thoughts lead to some pretty negative consequences, emotionally and in how we behave.
Absolutely. That's the C in the model. You might feel really discouraged. Avoid doing presentations in the future, or even start doubting your abilities in general. Those are the consequences of those negative beliefs if you don't challenge them.
But the great thing about this model is that it doesn't end there. We can actually do something about it.
Right. Exactly. That's where D comes in. Disputation. This is where we really put those pessimistic thoughts on trial, Seligman suggests. Asking yourself some key questions like, what evidence do I have for this belief? Is there another way to look at the situation? What's the worst that could happen, and how likely is that?
Okay, so in that example, with the presentation feedback, instead of just assuming I'm a terrible presenter, you could look at the feedback itself. Maybe your boss just said, you need to work on your visuals or your delivery. It's not about you as a person. It's constructive criticism you can learn from.
Right. You can also think about other explanations. Maybe your boss was having a stressful day, or maybe the feedback was more about the content of the presentation than your skills as a presenter.
So it's about challenging those automatic negative thoughts and coming up with more balanced and realistic interpretations. And once we've successfully disputed those negative thoughts, what happens then?
Well, that's where I get to E, energization. That feeling of empowerment and motivation that comes from challenging those pessimistic beliefs. Instead of feeling defeated and discouraged, you get the surge of energy and a renewed sense of possibility.
It's like we've broken free from the chains of pessimism, and
Mhm.
now we're free to move forward with a more positive and hopeful outlook.
Exactly. And that shift in energy can affect everything in your life. You're more likely to take risks, push through challenges, and achieve your goals when you're coming from a place of optimism and empowerment.
This ABCDE model is really making sense to me now. It's like a step-by-step guide to
Yep.
rewiring our brains for optimism. But I'm wondering, how can we apply this to other areas of life beyond just our personal challenges? You mentioned parenting earlier. Can you talk more about how learned optimism can shape how we raise our children?
Oh, absolutely. Seligman really emphasizes how important it is to model optimism for our kids. They're like little sponges. They soak up the attitudes and behaviors they see around them. If we're always complaining and focusing on the negative, they're more likely to become pessimistic themselves.
So it's not enough to just tell them to be positive. We have to actually show them how it's done.
Exactly. It's about showing them, through our own actions and reactions, how to deal with challenges in a resilient and optimistic way. So, for example, when things don't go our way, instead of, having a meltdown or giving up, we can show them how to problem solve, how to be flexible, and how to believe that things will work out in the end.
We're teaching them that setbacks are just temporary bumps in the road, not these giant obstacles that can't be overcome. And this approach goes hand in hand with constructive criticism,
Right.
which we talked about before.
Absolutely. So instead of criticizing the child, saying something like, "You're so clumsy," we can focus on the specific behavior and offer guidance, like, "Let's practice holding the glass with two hands so it doesn't spill." We can also help them develop their own disputation skills by asking questions like, "Why do you think that happened?" Or "What could you do differently next time?"
We're basically giving them the tools to
Right.
become little optimists themselves.
Exactly. And those tools will be valuable for them their whole lives, not just in childhood. Imagine a classroom where these principles are part of how they teach.
That's a fascinating thought. Instead of just focusing on academics, schools could also teach students how to be optimistic, how to be resilient,
Right here.
and how to have a growth mindset.
That's right. They could integrate the ABCDE model into their lessons, encourage students to figure out their own explanatory styles, and give them chances to practice those disputation skills. This could make a huge difference, not just in their grades, but also in their relationships and their overall well-being.
And it's not just limited to schools.
Right.
These principles could be useful in workplaces, on sports teams,
Yeah.
even in politics. Remember Seligman's research on optimistic political candidates?
Oh, yeah. That was interesting. He found that leaders who are optimistic and who inspire hope tend to be more effective at getting people to work together toward a common goal. They create this atmosphere of possibility where people believe they can actually make a difference.
It's like they're tapping into that collective commons we were talking about, that sense of shared purpose and belonging.
Exactly. And that feeling of shared purpose, it can be a powerful antidote to the individualism and isolation that Seligman says can contribute to depression. It's about shifting our focus from me to we and realizing that how we're doing individually is tied to how our communities and the world around us are doing.
This idea of the commons is really resonating with me. It's making me think about the things in my own life that connects me to something larger than myself, like my family, my community, my passion for environmental activism.
Those are all great examples. And nurturing those connections can be a really powerful way to build a more meaningful and resilient life. It's about finding those things that give us a sense of purpose and belonging, those things that remind us we're part of something bigger than ourselves.
It's like we're weaving this tapestry of meaning and connection, one thread at a time, one action at a time. And each time we choose optimism, each time we challenge a negative thought, we're adding another vibrant strand to that tapestry.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that tapestry, woven with those threads of optimism, resilience, and connection, it can be a source of strength and inspiration. As we go through life, it can help us weather the storms, celebrate the victories, and navigate all the complexities of being human with a sense of hope and purpose.
This has been such a rich and insightful look at Seligman's work. We've covered so much, from the science of explanatory style, to the power of the ABCDE model, to how our thinking patterns affect society. And we've even talked about the importance of connecting to something bigger than ourselves, that commons that Seligman talks about. But there's one more really important part of learned optimism that I want to get into. How do we actually put all of this into practice in our daily lives? How can we actually cultivate a more optimistic outlook? Let's explore those practical strategies after a quick break.
So welcome back to our deep dive into learned optimism. We've explored a lot of the concepts, and now I'm really curious about the practical stuff. How can we actually use these ideas in our everyday lives?
That's a great question, and that's really what makes Seligman's work so valuable. It's not just theory. He gives us actual tools we can use to change how we think and how we live our lives.
It's like we've got the blueprints now, and now it's time to build. So where do we even start? One of the best places to start is just by becoming more aware of your own explanatory style. Start paying attention to how you explain things, especially when something bad happens. Do you tend to see those setbacks as permanent, like they're never going to change? Do you see them as pervasive, like it affects everything in your life? And do you see them as personal, like it's all your fault? Or do you see those setbacks as temporary? They're just a blip on the radar, specific to that situation and as something you can learn and grow from.
So we become alike,
Yeah.
detectives of our own thoughts,
Yeah.
just observing the patterns
Mm-hmm.
without judging ourselves. And then once we've spotted those pessimistic tendencies, we can start using the ABCDE model to challenge them.
Exactly. Remember, the A stands for adversity. That's the difficult
Yeah.
situation. The B is for beliefs, those automatic thoughts that just pop up. The C is for consequences, the emotional and behavioral outcomes that come from those beliefs. And then the D is where the real work happens, disputation.
Okay, so let's say I spill coffee all over my new white shirt right before a big meeting. My automatic thought might be, oh no, this always happens to me. I'm such a klutz.
There you go. That's a classic pessimistic belief. It's permanent, always, it's pervasive, I'm a klutz, and it's personal. But instead of letting that thought spiral and make you feel frustrated and bad about yourself, you can use disputation to challenge it.
So I put on my detective hat and I ask myself, wait a minute, does this really always happen to me? Or is this just a really memorable incident because it's a new shirt and I have this important meeting?
Exactly. You're looking at the evidence, and you might realize that you don't actually spill things that often. This is just bad luck at a really inconvenient time.
And I can also think about other possible explanations. Maybe I was rushing this morning because I hit the snooze button too many times. Or maybe the coffee cup was just slippery. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm a klutz.
You got it. And by disputing those pessimistic beliefs, you can change how you feel. Instead of being frustrated and blaming yourself, you can see things in a more neutral way, or even a positive way.
So instead of walking into that meeting feeling embarrassed and flustered, I might be able to just laugh it off or accept it as a minor inconvenience.
Right. And that's the power of the ABCDE model. It gives you the ability to control your thoughts and emotions instead of letting them control you.
It's like we're building mental muscle, and the more we use it, the stronger it gets. But Seligman also talks about other things we can do to cultivate optimism.
Right.
He mentions gratitude journals and focusing on our strengths.
Those are great examples of what Seligman calls flexible optimism techniques. They're not about pretending everything is perfect or forcing ourselves to be happy all the time. It's about intentionally focusing on the good stuff in our lives.
So even when things are tough, we can still find things to be grateful for. It could be something small, like a cup of tea, a sunny day, a kind word from a stranger.
Exactly. And when we regularly focus on those good experiences, we're training our brains to notice and appreciate the good things more easily.
What about focusing on our strengths? How does that help with learned optimism?
Well, Seligman says, everybody has unique strengths and talents. And when we identify and use those strengths, we feel more confident, more competent, more fulfilled. It's like we've found the key that unlocks our potential.
So it's not about trying to fix all our weaknesses. It's about recognizing and using the things we're already good at.
Exactly. And when we feel good about ourselves and what we're capable of, we're more likely to approach challenges with optimism and resilience. It's like having a secret weapon.
This all ties back to that idea of the commons that we talked about before. It's about finding those things that connect us to something bigger than ourselves, something that gives us a sense of purpose and belonging.
Absolutely, when we're doing things that match our values and our strengths. And when we feel connected to something bigger than ourselves, we naturally develop a more optimistic outlook.
It's like we're tapping into a source of renewable energy, the energy of purpose, connection, meaning.
I like that. And that energy, it fuels our optimism, our resilience, our ability to thrive, even when things get tough.
This deep dive into learned optimism has been really amazing. We've explored how our thinking works, the ABCDE model,
Hmm.
and how our thoughts affect society. And we've even talked about the commons, that idea of connecting to something bigger than ourselves. But most importantly, we've learned some practical strategies for living a more optimistic and fulfilling life.
Remember, optimism is a journey. It's not a destination. It's about making those small choices every day to challenge those negative thoughts and to see things in a more hopeful and empowered way. It's about recognizing that we have the power to shape our own experiences and to create a life that's full of meaning
Barbarous.
and joy.
We encourage you to take these ideas and make them your own. Figure out your explanatory style. Practice the ABCDE model. Focus on your strengths and find those things that connect you to the commons, things that resonate with you. We believe that everyone can learn to be optimistic and live a life that's full of hope, resilience, and fulfillment. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into learned optimism.